I guess we start. My name is Billy Miller, and this is William E. Jones.
So I'm here to tell you a bit about who Boyd McDonald was. He was born in South Dakota in 1925, and he served in World War II. And after World War II, he went to Harvard. And it really transformed his life and his point of view on things. He was at Harvard in the late 40s at the same time as John Ashbery and Edward Gorey and Frank O'Hara. And he was part of a set of more or less openly gay guys at Harvard at that time. And after Harvard, he moved to New York City, and he became what he called a hack writer. He was hired by, whoa.
That's just what it sounds like when you delete something.
Okay, well, so something's in the trash now. He moved to New York City and worked for Time Life. He wrote for Time magazine. And he worked on a couple of columns. One was called Miscellany and another was called Milestones. And they were extremely short news items. They were highly edited. And Boyd had been interested in American literature. That was his major at Harvard. And I think he probably was extremely frustrated by the really intense editing that texts were subjected to.
But then I think that later on really came in.
Yeah.
Helpful.
Yeah, they had a technique called greening, where they would take a green pencil, or what you would write your texts, and they would go to makeup, which is the name of the department. It was where they would set them in type, and the makeup department would give you back a preliminary proof of the text, and the chief editor would say, no, you have to. It was a funny expression. It would say green 5, which would mean you would have to take a green pencil and strike out 5 lines of the text, or as many as, if it was a longer story, green 18, green 20. And greening was the verb that they used for cutting out text. And this is actually a skill that it did serve Boyd really well.
Not mean to interrupt, but I could see where that did, in one way that I noticed. He ran some of Robert Mapplethorpe's photos, before he was really well known, and there's one of them that had a lot of negative space around the picture, but Boyd just cropped it out and had the middle part, and apparently Robert Mapplethorpe got really mad, and Boyd said, I didn't do that, somebody else did it, but he actually did do it. Yeah. But he said, why bother with all that negative space? It doesn't, who wants to see that?
Yeah. So Boyd worked for Time Life, and he started drinking really heavily. He describes it in interviews how basically he entered the workforce, and he started drinking on the first day, and he became a really serious alcoholic with a big problem. He actually had a very interesting writing life, much more interesting than he let on. He did dismiss it all as hack work, but in the research I did for my biography, I discovered from one of his relatives that he'd actually written for 6 months for a newspaper in Natchez, Mississippi.
Wow.
And he wrote articles for that were pretty interesting, and one was especially interesting, and it was called Place of No Address, or House of No Address, and it was about a woman who was about one step above homelessness, who lived in a shack in the jungle region below Natchez by the Mississippi River. And he interviewed her and wrote that, and it was published in the paper. And that actually is the one early article by Boyd's that I reproduce in its entirety in the biography. Because I thought it was interesting to give a sense of what he was like as a writer before he started Straight to Hell. So anyway, I think he probably lost a series of jobs. He worked for IBM for a while, and he did freelance work, but he really couldn't keep a job. He was drinking too heavily. And at the end of the 60s, he was in a very bad way. He ended up drying out in Central Islip Psychiatric Hospital on Long Island in 1968. And he never drank again. He went through DTs, it was a horrible thing, and he came out of the hospital and he said he carried all his possessions in a shopping bag. And at that point he went on welfare. He found a room in an SRO hotel. For those of you who are of more elevated social class, SRO stands for single room occupancy. And he lived in a single room essentially for the rest of his life, which was from 1968 to 1993. At the beginning of that time, he was probably casting about for something to do with his life, and this is from interviews. He was fascinated with foreskin, and he started corresponding with people about this, and he had a kind of one-sheet zine, a predecessor of a zine called Skinheads, and it was about uncircumcised men. He started advertising in gay magazines for people to correspond with. And this began a kind of flood of correspondence. And he thought, I've got to do something with this stuff. And that's when he got the idea for Straight to Hell, the first issue of which was, I think, 73.
73.
Yeah. And he started printing true homosexual experiences, the sex stories that people would volunteer to him, would write into him. He became almost like the switchboard of homosexual desire for men who could, write their sex stories.
It's important to note that they were published anonymously.
Yeah, he never put anyone's name, although there were people you could guess who they were if you knew
He used to
enough.
give them names too, like there's one guy called the Hillbilly Cocksucker, and he had names like that for them.
Yeah, there's one guy named Jim Dugan, probably not his real name, but he had this enormously long series. There was like 5 very long sex stories. Well, they weren't just sex stories. He was actually also telling the stories of his great uncle, whom he'd had sex with.
Oh yeah, I remember
Yeah,
those,
and he was actually someone who he had sex stories from the early part of the 20th century. And he was one of the people who helped build the New York City subway system. And he told stories of having sex with workers who were helping to build the subway. So, what he was compiling, people took it to be a kind of pornographic work, but what he considered it to be was history. He wanted there to be a history of gay desire I don't know if he wouldn't probably have even used the word gay, but he wanted the word.
No, Boyd, and that's one reason why we got along, is we were both allergic to that word, basically, or idea, etc.
And so another, in parentheses, we could talk about the distinction he made between homosexual and gay.
Yeah.
The year that Boyd sort of, withdrew from the workplace and started living in a single room was right before gay liberation. And the era that Boyd remembered fondly was the era between World War II and the late 60s, before liberation. And he drew a distinction between homosexual and gay. Gay for him was political, and it was the public face of homosexuality. And it was always kind of neutered. All the politicians who would be behind, reforms for gay people were really not talking about their sex lives. They were talking about sex in abstract terms. They were talking about, making different kinds of families and having political power. And they weren't interested in the specifics of homosexual sex. And that was Boyd's obsession.
Yeah.
Want to expand on that a little?
Well, just one thing I was thinking about when you said about his room, that I just was remembering one time when he smoked, he lived off black coffee, sugar donuts, and cigarettes. And so when I'd go over there, he would frown on anything, like I tried to bring him soup and stuff, and that was just too piss elegant, is the word he liked to use. Food, basically, was too piss elegant. So I would just sit there chain smoking with him because I thought, oh, well, I got to act like I can do this too, you know. But I would be ready to pass out because smoking, chain smoking, drinking black coffee, even putting milk in coffee was like way too much for him. So anyway, from all those years of smoking, that room, which probably was painted white at some point, was like a light brown, from nicotine. And at one point, they kept saying he had to paint it, and he said, oh, I don't want to paint it. So one time they made him paint it, so he wouldn't move anything. So they just moved this great big pile of stuff, all his stuff in the middle of the room, and it never moved back again. It just stayed in the middle of the room for the rest of the time that I knew him. He never even moved it back again. Yeah. He was, but I know I forgot your question or what we were going to talk about.
Oh, well, you can expand more on, his notion of homosexuality as well. Well,
to me, Boyd and I never talked about anything in intellectual kind of things. He was actually really smart and really well read and knew about a wide range of things, in a kind of classical education. But he was almost embarrassed by that in a way. He'd always he didn't like to use big words, and he liked to use certain kinds of words phrases like piss elegant and stuff like that. So my relationship with him was all about trying to crack each other up and things like that. Like I may have told you a story of one time because he lived in this SRO and they would let me up there. So one time I came in and the door was open a little bit and it was really dark in there and I was like, Boyd, are you in there? And I just see this light come on. It's like a cigarette. And I opened up the door and he had a ski mask on. He was like smoking a cigarette in the dark with a ski mask. But then didn't just with a total straight face. And it just wore the whole ski mask for an hour after that while I was talking to him. That was his weird sense of humor and stuff, But anyway, we both kind of thought that the word gay sounded like people, skipping through a field of flowers or something like that,
That's a part of it too.
Yeah, so I have different ideas about things than Boyd did, but we overlapped on that kind of stuff. So he, and then you talk about his being in an asylum, a hospital or whatever. So a few months after I met him, he kind of had this weird nervous breakdown. And I say weird because he didn't let on. He just seemed the same to me, but he checked himself into this psychiatric ward, and which was the same place I was. I wasn't in the psychiatric ward, but it's a long story, but I was going to this hospital, so I took him there, and then when they let him out, I went and got him, and so we sort of bonded on a lot of things, like being crazy and humor and things like that, but I just never met anyone like that before. He just had a very unique take on things that was empowering, because the first time I saw Straight to Hell in the 70s, it was just amazing. I think one of them was called Can Heterosexuality Be Cured? And things like that. And I thought, wow, who's got the nerve to say something like that? Yeah. It was just liberating, basically. You know?
Yeah, the publication, which, I say it in the book, and I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. Straight to Hell was the first queer zine.
I don't like that word zine, but yeah.
Well, we live with it here in this.
I know, but to me, zine is the only difference between a zine and a magazine is a magazine has corporate advertising. Yeah. And zine sounds like another word for amateur or something, because all the stuff that Boyd put into that was he was very focused, and that's top-notch writing. So, yeah, I guess over the years, I'm okay with calling something a zine. But
decades of people have drawn inspiration from him.
Yeah.
All these people we see selling zines out there on the table.
That would have really surprised Boyd.
He's like their predecessor.
He would have been really surprised by the way things have gone, because when I knew him, Straight to Hell was sold, only in dirty bookstores and stuff, and there was nobody in an academic world. Towards the end, they were just starting to do that a little bit. In fact, there was one time that was a gay and lesbian film festival in the 80s, and they were going to give him money to do this presentation, and I was going to help him with it. And then 2 days before, he just, something about it, he just didn't like it, and he didn't do it. But he would be, like now, there's people in the fashion world, for instance, who are interested in Straight to Hell, and that would be something that Boyd would have just, it's like totally left field from what he was into. So,
well, the publication went through certain transformations while he was still editing it.
Yeah.
It began as really just mimeographed sheets, and I think the early issues are really only about 6 or 10 pages. And then it got bigger and bigger, and the production values got a little higher, and the circulation got much higher.
Well, it caught on right away with a certain group of people, but I think the production values was less him than he was using printers and people, and it was, people look at it now and they like the design of it, but that was just the way it was put together in that time. It wasn't really designed.
Yeah.
And so then when Victor Weaver, the middle editor, took over, he created a look based on that, and he also brought in this baby boomer kind of fascination with things like that, and it changed then, and all of a sudden, and then it reached out to a hipster crowd and became bigger that way, and then I took both of those things and expanded on them, except during the time I've done it, the publishing world is just, goes away more and more every day. So now we're in a point where, people say, why don't you approach Toshin to do a complete compendium of them? And that would never happen, because they're not going to publish something with swastikas on it and some of the other stuff that I won't even talk about that's in there that is just not cool in today's environment. So it's still ahead of its time, or radical in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So when the publication really started, he had an audience of men who would write in, and they were happy to share their sexual experiences. I think some of them may even have had the notion that there was nobody else in the world who did this but them, and then they saw Straight to Hell and they realized there are others. And so they really felt themselves to be part of some kind of community or fellowship. And it was really this primary kind of identification in the beginning. People were writing in, and the letters just poured in. But at a certain point, and I think that this had to do with the commercial availability of porn, people started not really being so spontaneous with the way they wrote in. And so Boyd, he counteracted that by devising these incredibly elaborate questionnaires. Every single detail of a sex act and anatomy and the atmosphere around it, he would ask for details.
Oh, that he told me when I do it, don't get them to describe the acts, because he didn't really care about how their reasoning or their motivation or anything. He wanted to hear the descriptions of the actual acts. Like he would always say, ask him about the smell, because people don't talk about smells and taste and things like that. So.
And the other thing about Boyd is that he was an editor. He wasn't just a writer, but he worked as an editor in many of his jobs that he had before he dried out and became the editor of Straight to Hell. And so the skill of greening, of editing lines out of text, he used it with the letters. There was a certain amount of controversy around Straight to Hell. There were people who were really kind of against it, who circulated the story that Boyd was making all these stories up himself.
That was not true. I can verify that was not true, because I saw the letters, and he gave me a bag of them. Yeah. But there's a lot of that. Not so much anymore, but in the 80s and 90s, there were articles written in I don't know if you could call it the gay mainstream, that would just really tear him apart. And there was also problems with getting things over the border in Canada and Australia and other things. And then they were very random, though. Like certain things would be censored and other things wouldn't be. And that was all part of what made it cool to me too.
Well, what Boyd would do is that he would never paraphrase, he would never rewrite somebody's writing, but he would cut it down.
Oh yeah.
And so someone might send him a 3-page letter, and he would boil it down to a single paragraph. But he wouldn't put any words in the writer's mouth. He would just get it down to the absolute essential part of the story. And this is something that I think he had practiced from working at Time Life, from working for all these different companies doing editing of corporate writing. And so, it seemed incredible that people were writing in these experiences, but they really did.
And also, people, especially younger people, he was doing this on an old...
May I have your attention, please? LA Art Book Fair will be closing in 15 minutes.
Oh, really?
Wow.
That's weird.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? LA Art Book Fair will be closing in 15 minutes.
He did this on a manual typewriter,
Yes.
Not even the electric kind. He did it on the regular manual. He was a really good typist, and so that noise alone was something.
Yeah.
And you had to really press down on it.
Yeah, he was an old-fashioned kind of guy.
He didn't even want an electric one.
No.
He also did not want a fan or an air conditioner, and he'd be in there just so hot in that room, just pouring sweat. And one time I said, okay, no, this is like, you have to have a fan. So he wouldn't buy it, but when I got the fan, he tolerated the fan, but the air conditioner was definitely no. The same thing with a refrigerator or a stove, or he had a hot plate. He had them take the refrigerator out of the room, basically. So it was just...
He was an incredible creature. He could have had an incredibly privileged life.
Yeah.
He went to Harvard, he worked in corporate America, and then he renounced it all. And he lived this incredibly severe life.
I think this it's maybe extreme to use this language, but I always thought him as kind of like a Homo Saint or something, because he was like in the zone. He took everything so humor was very important to him, but he took it all very seriously.
Yeah.
And the writings that people would send in to him, these sex stories and everything, were great writing. And he would always say, what other people would think of as, what someone would think as good writing would not be what he would be interested in.
No, he would always talk about the one wonders, one thinks, the one dreams style of writing.
Oh, he had a great
And
way of using language.
His worst insult to a writer was, this guy writes the way Liberace dresses. If you remember who Liberace is.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, maybe since we're going to probably get these awful announcements for the rest of the time we're talking, do you think maybe we should take questions from
Sure.
people? Yeah. Anybody have a question for us about Boyd? Because we know the material rather well, and maybe we haven't
Or
told
just
you
straight to
everything you
hell,
need to
or
know. Or
anything,
straight to hell, yeah.
or anything. No? Oh.
Can you talk about the books?
The compilation books?
No, Bill's book.
Ah!
Oh,
yeah.
Bill's books. Oh, yeah.
I've got to plug myself.
Yes.
So, years ago, I was researching a biography of Fred Halstead that was later published by Semiotext. And I was at the One Archives in Los Angeles, which, if you don't know it, is the largest gay and lesbian archive in the world. And while I was doing that research, I thought, I want to look up Boyd's writing about film. Boyd, during the 80s, had a column for Christopher Street, which was a gay literary magazine, and he wrote about movies. Most of the essays that he wrote were compiled in a book called Cruising the Movies that was published in 1985. That was amazing. And it's a book I bought at the time it came out and really loved it. And it's film criticism like no one else practices it. The butch lesbian legs of Ronald Reagan,
Yeah.
etc. And I thought to myself, there must be more essays out there that weren't compiled. So I looked at all these issues of Christopher Street and found other film essays by Boyd that had not been put in the book. And I approached Semiotext and asked if they would be interested in republishing an expanded edition. And at the time they weren't. But then a couple of years went by and they approached me and said, we'd like you to do an introduction to the new edition. And so I wrote this introduction, and it was supposed to be about 8,000 words, but I just couldn't stop writing. Boyd's life was so fascinating. His position in culture was so interesting. I wrote and wrote, and I eventually got a draft of like 25,000 words, which is about half a book, and presented the semiotext, and they said, we can't use this is too long. So I cut it back to 8,000 words, and then I worked more and more on it, and I eventually got a manuscript of 50,000 words, which is like a 200-page book. And then I sort of plotted its publication with the man who asked the question, and the press is called We Heard You Like Books, and it's just beginning now with Jarrett's book, I Hate the Internet. And the next book is coming out in April, and it is, here's the card, if you want one, True Homosexual Experiences, Boyd McDonald and Straight to Hell, which is the first proper biography of Boyd McDonald. And something I didn't mention at all is, a lot of this sort of sex stuff, which was, written about in the press, it was only part of Boyd. One of the most important things for my research was that I managed to get hold of people in his family. And he had a niece who adored him, whom he adored, and she gave me a very long interview and told me what a loving uncle he was, and how he was an inspiration to her and encouraged her to be nonconformist in her own life and to go her own way and not be cowed by other people's opinions or by peer pressure. And he was really tremendously inspirational for her. And I just talked to her on the phone last week, and she's overjoyed that Boyd's memory is still alive.
Well, I'm really happy that you did this because he's so important in history in general, and if you look him up online until this, there's some Canadian composer or something that comes up, and there's almost nothing really.
Yeah, there's very little about Boyd, and he's I think a crucial figure. I hate to use the word underground, but he's a kind of crucial underground figure in American culture that has not yet received the attention he deserves.
I think part of that is because at the time, his writing and the things that he was writing about was just so out of the mainstream, for lack of a better word, that it's taken till now that people could even because I've met over the years a lot of people who were really into it but were embarrassed in a way. Like there's a guy I met who was the head librarian at Columbia, and he wrote the most raunchy stories all the time, but you never would have known that if it his work. And it used to also be the thing up until really people my age, and even now, the people older than me, from even the older baby boomers, generally when they get older, they would throw away all this material and everything because they wouldn't want their families to ever see this. Yeah. So it was almost you had two different lives. A lot of times these people would have these, be sucking dick in Macy's, but then they would be church going and everything. So Boyd was also someone who was just different in that way, especially someone of his generation, that he didn't do that. And maybe he did do that when he was younger, and maybe all this alcoholism and everything was just, it was like, boiling up in him until he finally just couldn't have it anymore, and just no matter what, he had to be who he was.
Yeah, and you mentioned, people throwing things away so their family wouldn't find it. Unfortunately, in Boyd's case, after he died, his sister, and not the niece I spoke to, but another niece, cleaned out his room.
I was wondering about that, because I was going to go over to his place like the day after he died, and then I thought, well, do I really have the right to do this? And I talked to his sister on the phone, who asked me, she said, is it true he was a homosexual? And then I thought, because one thing I was interested in, he talked about he was writing a fiction book, and a little bit of it was published in a nonfiction story was published in one of the Straight to Hells. So I always wondered, was that in there with all of that stuff, and it got thrown out?
Unfortunately, it all got thrown away.
That's just awful, because he was always working on something. So.
Yeah, and this is something we should be thinking about now. That there are these incredible archives that people accumulate over the course of their lives that should not be thrown away. They should be donated to a real archive like the One Archives, or they should be preserved by members of the family And unfortunately, we have decades and decades of history that have just disappeared because families, they don't even know what they have, or maybe what they have embarrasses them, and they throw it away. But in Boyd's case, there was a bit more than I expected. Even though all these personal papers were thrown away, there was quite a bit that I was able to accumulate to write the book from. But there are gaps. You know?
Did you know, I don't know if this is true, that somebody told me that Boyd was a stage manager for some Broadway plays. Did you ever hear that?
I had heard it, but I didn't get any confirmation of
There was
it.
one called Via Galactica. It was by the same
Yeah.
guys that did Hair.
Yeah.
And that one was like, what? Stage director for Broadway? Like, I don't know. I guess he could do anything, but
I couldn't figure out where to put that in the book, so I'm
And I
afraid
also
it's
heard
not there.
he went by the nickname Buddy. Did you ever hear that?
No.
That was another
It's
one. I
news
heard.
to me.
Yeah.
Who called him Buddy?
I'm forgetting this guy. He had a bookstore in, he died a couple years ago, had a bookstore in Boston.
John Mitzel?
John Mitzel told me that.
Yeah.
And he and Boyd, see, this is where Boyd and I didn't do this, because see, Boyd would have that, like, I don't know what you call it, that humor where you call everyone her and she and
Shebonics.
Shebonics and everything. That's not me, so I didn't bond with him with that.
Yeah.
So John and he would get on the phone for a long time saying, oh, did you hear about her and what she did and all that other kind of stuff? And like, so John probably got much more dishy stuff than I ever heard.
And you know, unfortunately, John Mitzel died before I started the book.
That is too bad, because he really was a good friend of Boyd's. So.
Yeah, there were 3 people I really wanted to speak to who died before I started my research. Gore Vidal, who was a friend of Boyd's and who spoke to him on the phone all the time, and John Mitzel, who we mentioned, and Larry Miller, I think was his name. He was his editor at Gay Presses of New York.
Oh, one thing I should mention that you brought up about editing. So at one point, Boyd interviewed William Burroughs, and he had very explicit questions. But I could never find that, because there's one issue where it says next issue interview with William Burroughs. So I was like, well, what happened to that? I found out what happened to that. That James Garholtz, who was William Burroughs' sort of boyfriend and editor, at that point was managing Burroughs' career, and he went through and greenlined a lot of the really embarrassing stuff because he thought this is not going to be good for William Burroughs' career. And so when Boyd saw that he had taken out all of this juicy stuff, he decided not to do it. So one time I called James Garholtz on the phone. I know someone that knows him. And he said it was at some library in Ohio, but it was, I don't know if it had the original interview on it, and I just was too lazy to pursue it, to find it, and I don't even know if it exists, but that would be something to find that. Though.
I asked James Grauerholtz about this, and he never got back to me about it.
Well,
And
that's something
it
we
was
can
an
talk
interview
about,
that was suppressed for the magazine, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well.
He did interview Mapplethorpe. That appears in one of the issues. And that's another thing that I reproduce in the book in its entirety because it's quite an amusing interview. But it's, you know, a little sanitized. Mapplethorpe realizes at that point that he's going to be world famous, so he doesn't actually come across with the most explicit details. But he's a good sport about it. It is an interesting interview. Are we almost out of time? Let's see. Yeah, we've got 2 minutes. Anybody got a quick question? Yes.
I have a quick question. Is there an anthology of his writing for your publication, or is it scattered right now? Especially by his interviews with, or his editing of the section.
Yeah, in the early 80s, he stopped doing Straight to Hell and handed the editorship to Victor Weaver, and he concentrated on compilation books, of which I have one copy.
I think there are 13 altogether.
There are 13.
And
yeah.
you know, I was trying to think of something, because
Here's
he
one.
went
It's
through
called-
all the names. I don't know what else you can come up with
He's
after
called,
that.
this one's called Cum, and it's actually my personal favorite.
It was cum, piss, wads,
Meat.
scum, meat.
Yeah.
And I was like thinking, God, you covered all of them. Like, I can't think of another one. No.
But they're all subtitled True Homosexual Experiences, and you can still find them.
And they have a little bit of his editorials in them.
Yeah, they're definitely editorial remarks. By the way, At 7 p.m. at the $1 Million Theater, there's a reading that has been organized by Hans Ulrich Obrist, and I'm taking part, and I will be reading a selection from Come. They asked us to read books that had inspired us, and that was my
Awesome.
choice. And I warned them it's going to be filthy, so they've been warned. Is that it?
I guess so.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
That's what she said.
I don't know how to turn this off. Do you?
No, I guess they'll turn it off.
Okay.